In late August of 1998, 7 college friends packed their cars on a sticky Friday morning and drove away from Knoxville. They were barely out of their teens, restless for one last adventure before the fall semester began. None of them expected the trip to become more than a weekend escape, filled with hiking, campfires, and late-night laughter under the stars. They were the kind of friends who recorded everything. Tyler Hayes brought along his father's Sony Hi8 camcorder, a clunky silver one that captured their laughter in the parking lot, their cheerful goodbyes to the skyline, and the long drive into Cherokee National Forest. The camera turned them into storytellers, unaware they were documenting the last normal hours of their lives. The group was made up of 3 young men and 4 women. Tyler, 21, was the planner, steady, thoughtful, always the one checking maps before anyone else asked. His best friend, Drew Callahan, 22, was the opposite, confident, loud, impulsive, and always behind the wheel. His girlfriend, Katie Monroe, rode beside him, auburn hair whipping in the wind as she leaned out the window filming the others. Behind them, Emily Ward, a journalism major with quiet curiosity, drove her small green Saturn. Her roommate, Brianna, sat in the passenger seat, bright and talkative, keeping the ride alive with jokes that filled the tape with laughter. In the last car were Jordan McCoy, tall patient, the group's outdoor expert, and his girlfriend, Leah Parsons, who had never been camping before but agreed to go because Jordan loved it. That afternoon, the tape showed them stopping at a small gas station near Tellico Plains. They bought snacks, ice, and a paper map, since cell service in the mountains barely existed back then. The camera caught Drew pretending to be a travel show host, interviewing everyone about their grand Appalachian expedition. The laughter felt natural and unguarded, the kind of moment that could belong to anyone. Watching it decades later feels hauntingly ordinary. The calm before something no one could predict. Their plan was simple: drive up a Forest Service road to reach an old fire lookout tower that Jordan had read about on a hiking forum. It wasn't on any official trail maps, but he'd heard it still stood on a ridge called Black Hollow. Jordan thought it would make great footage, something wild and cinematic. The tape then showed them arriving at a gravel pull-off late that afternoon. Behind them, the forest stretched endlessly, layers of green shadow, soft wind, and the faint smell of rain. They filmed as they unpacked sleeping bags, tents, and a cooler. Katie asked if this was really the right spot. Jordan laughed and said, "Yeah, trail's right up there," pointing toward what looked more like a narrow animal path than a trail. The others followed, teasing him that he was going to get them lost. By sunset, they were nearly 3 miles deep into the woods. The trail grew faint beneath the thick brush. The footage turned shaky as light disappeared. Laya's voice could be heard saying she felt like they'd been walking in circles. Tyler checked his compass, frowned, and said the reading felt off. Maybe interference. Still, they pressed on. The next clip showed them around a small campfire, faces glowing in orange light. Brianna's voice narrated playfully, "Night 1, Black Hollow. Us." It felt warm and harmless until you noticed Tyler glance toward the dark tree line, just once, as if hearing something. They were supposed to return by Sunday evening. When Monday came and no one showed up for class or work, it didn't feel urgent. Maybe they stayed another night. Maybe car trouble. But by Tuesday, parents began calling. Drew's mother couldn't reach his phone. Emily's roommate said her bed hadn't been touched. By Wednesday, police were notified. Search teams reached the trailhead that same day. Both vehicles were still there, clean, locked, untouched. Inside Drew's Jeep, investigators found maps, a disposable camera, and Katie's purse. In Tyler's Honda trunk, everything was neatly packed: clothes, food, and a spare fuel canister. The group had clearly planned to hike light and return soon. There were no signs of panic, no damage, no broken glass. Rangers began retracing every possible route, marking trails and fire roads within 5 miles. Cherokee National Forest is vast. Dense ridges, deep hollows, narrow valleys where sound dies quickly. Even expert hikers get lost there today. But in 1998, clues disappeared fast. Teams reported faint traces of movement. A scrap of fabric caught on a branch, what looked like boot prints near a creek bed. But heavy rain came that weekend, washing away almost everything. Within 2 days, even the scent dogs lost the trail. Families camped near the ranger station. Parents slept in their cars. Volunteers scoured the undergrowth with flashlights and sticks. At one point, a tracker swore he heard a woman's voice echoing through the trees. When they called out, the forest answered with silence. The search widened in the following week. Helicopters scanned from above looking for campfires, tarps, anything reflective. Nothing. The official report later called it an immediate and total disappearance. The first real clue surfaced 2 weeks later. A hiker found a single mud-caked hiking boot wedged near a creek about 4 miles from the cars. Investigators matched it to photos from the video. It belonged to Leah Parsons. The discovery brought no comfort, only dread. By then, locals had begun whispering about the ridge. Some claimed the area near the old fire lookout had been closed years earlier, that something had happened there long ago. No one knew details, only warnings. One ranger quietly told reporters that the trail the group likely followed didn't appear on any recent maps, as if it had been deliberately erased. Weeks passed. The official search ended, but families refused to stop. Tyler's father printed missing posters. Emily's brother returned every weekend with a flashlight, walking until exhaustion forced him back. Almost 3 months after the disappearance, a park maintenance worker clearing debris near a drainage culvert noticed something wedged between 2 rocks, a cracked mud-covered Sony Hi8 camcorder. The lens was shattered, the casing dented, the battery long dead, but inside the tape remained intact. No one could have imagined what it contained. For investigators, it was the first tangible clue, the only surviving witness from that lost weekend. When they pressed play weeks later, laughter filled the room, the sound of 7 young voices carefree and alive. Then came something no one in that room would ever forget. By the time the official search began, nearly a full week had passed since anyone had seen them alive. Cherokee National Forest spans over 500,000 acres, an ocean of dense timber and steep ravines where even veteran rangers get disoriented. Sheriff's deputies arrived before dawn, parking in the same gravel lot where the 2 cars still sat untouched. The scene felt frozen. Dust coated the hoods. Rain streaked the mirrors. Nothing was out of place, yet something about the silence felt wrong. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Every sound was swallowed by the trees. And though no one said it aloud, everyone there sensed it. The truth that whatever had happened to those 7 friends had not been an accident. The tape was only the beginning. No broken glass. No sign of panic. Their keys were missing, yet every door remained locked. It was as if the group had simply walked into the forest and never looked back. Within 24 hours, search operations were fully underway. Helicopters hovered low over the treetops, their rotors scattering mist. Tracking dogs arrived from 3 counties away. Rangers set up temporary command posts near the trailhead, dividing the terrain into meticulous search grids. Maps of the surrounding ridges were taped to folding tables, red markers circling possible routes toward the old fire lookout tower, their presumed destination. By the 3rd day, over 200 volunteers had joined, forming lines across the thick undergrowth. Locals from nearby towns brought supplies, flashlights, even ATVs. The area was known for sudden weather shifts, fog rolling in like smoke and vanishing within minutes. Searchers described it as if the forest itself were breathing. Some seasoned trackers began noticing strange occurrences. Compass readings drifted several degrees off true north. Radios hissed with static or cut out entirely. GPS devices lost signal deep in the ravines. The terrain seemed determined to swallow any trace of the missing group. Despite the manpower, nothing turned up. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no campfire evidence, not even the familiar pattern of trampled grass where tents might have stood. One ranger later admitted it felt less like searching for missing hikers and more like chasing a rumor. Families gathered near the command post every morning, waiting for updates. Parents sat with hands clenched, eyes fixed on the tree line as if expecting someone to appear. Reporters arrived, setting up vans by the roadside, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. On television, the footage looked procedural. Maps, interviews, men in orange vests fanning out into the brush. On the ground, morale was unraveling. After 6 days, exhaustion set in. Rain fell for nearly 30 hours straight, turning creeks into brown torrents. Search dogs struggled to maintain scent trails. When the rain finally stopped, the forest floor had been scoured clean as if nature itself had erased the path behind them. Sheriff Don Mallory, who had led previous rescue operations in the region, told investigators the valley had a reputation locals rarely spoke about. He had handled 2 disappearances there in the 1970s. Both young men, both never found. Whispers had circulated about sinkholes, sudden drop-offs, and abandoned mine shafts hidden beneath the soil. Others blamed disorientation or magnetic anomalies known to scramble compasses. But none of that explained why 7 people traveling together could vanish without leaving a single clear trace. One night near the end of the first week, a local tracker named Carl Whitmore walked a grid alone near the upper ridge when he heard something he could not explain. He later swore it sounded like distant laughter, echoing across the hollow. Not one voice, but several, overlapping and fading in and out, almost playful. He called out, thinking maybe other volunteers were nearby, but no one answered. When his radio flickered back to life, the nearest search team was over a mile away. The next morning, he refused to go back up that ridge. By the 10th day, the search radius had expanded nearly 20 miles. Helicopters with infrared cameras scanned for heat signatures long after sundown, but the forest remained dark and empty. Investigators began to accept that if the group had gotten lost, exposure would have claimed them within the first 72 hours. Yet the lack of remains, no bones, no clothing, nothing, felt unnatural. As the days dragged on, the families refused to leave. They brought lawn chairs, coolers, and photos of their kids taped to poster boards. Each night, a ranger walked over quietly to tell them there was still no word. Some broke down in tears. Others just stared blankly into the woods. The tape from the recovered camcorder had not yet been publicly reviewed, but everyone knew about it. For many, it had become the only hope of understanding what had happened. 2 weeks after the search began, a small team followed a narrow drainage creek that split off from the main trail. It was not part of the official grid, too steep, too dense, but a volunteer thought he saw smoke residue on nearby branches. They climbed until they reached a small clearing, barely large enough for 2 tents. The ground was blackened, littered with melted aluminum and bits of charred nylon. Someone had made a fire large, hot, and uncontrolled. Investigators cordoned off the area and began sifting through the ashes. They found a few recognizable items: a scorched camping pot, half a shoe sole, fragments of plastic bottles, and a burnt section of blue tarp matching the type sold at an outdoor store near Knoxville. It was the first tangible evidence that the group had camped, but something about the site was wrong. No footprints led in or out. No cooking gear remained beyond what had melted in the fire. No trace of human remains. The surrounding trees were unburned, suggesting the blaze had not spread naturally. It was as if the fire had been contained, built deliberately and then abandoned. Forensic teams analyzed soil samples and confirmed traces of accelerants not typical of a normal campfire. The conclusion was inconclusive. It could have been used to start a wet fire in poor conditions or to destroy evidence. Either way, it deepened the mystery. By then, the search had become more about recovery than rescue. Sheriff Mallory told the families privately that hope was fading. Yet even he admitted there was something about the site that did not make sense. The forest floor around the burnt area was covered with a thin layer of ash and pine needles, as if untouched for years. No animals had disturbed it. No wind had carried the soot away. It was frozen in time. When asked years later, one volunteer described standing in silence, surrounded by the endless quiet of the trees, realizing that if the 7 friends had met their end somewhere in that valley, the forest had done what it always does, kept its secrets. Months later, long after the official search had been called off, a hiker stumbled upon something that would pull the case back into the public eye and reopen every wound the families thought had begun to heal. It was the missing camcorder, half buried in mud near a creek bed, its tape miraculously intact. Whatever answers it held would prove even more haunting than the silence that came before it. In early spring of 2003, almost 5 years after the 7 college friends vanished, the case had grown quiet. Families still called the sheriff's office every few months hoping for updates that never came. The file was cold, the evidence exhausted, and the forest, so vast, so indifferent, had long since reclaimed whatever clues it once held. Then, one April morning, a lone hiker named Chris Delaney followed a narrow, seldom used trail along a creek in the lower Cherokee foothills when something caught his eye. Half buried in silt near a bend in the bank was a shape that didn't belong, metallic rectangular glinting faintly beneath the surface. He knelt down and pulled it free. It was a video camera. The casing was cracked, one side dented as if it had been dropped from a height. The strap was coated in mud, the lens shattered and the battery compartment corroded. But inside, lodged securely in its chamber, was a high-8 tape intact, its label still legible, OG 98 Trip. Delaney, unaware of its significance, brought it to the ranger station. Within 24 hours, the sheriff's office realized what it was. The serial number matched the missing group's camcorder. News spread quickly. For families who had spent years living in the shadow of uncertainty, it was the first tangible artifact since the day their children disappeared. The tape was sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for processing. Technicians dried and cleaned it, then transferred the footage to digital format frame by frame. When investigators finally watched the recovered footage, it began innocently enough, ordinary, even comforting. The group laughed as they loaded gear, crossed a creek barefoot, and argued playfully about who had forgotten to pack the lighter. For nearly 30 minutes, it was just 7 young people enjoying the last days of summer. But then, near the end, the tone changed. The final 15 minutes of footage were different. The handheld camera shook violently, its focus erratic. The screen went black several times as though the lens cap had been brushed or covered. When the image returned, it showed the beam of a flashlight darting through trees. Heavy breathing filled the audio. Someone whispered, "Hold on, stop, stop." There was a faint metallic clanging in the background, rhythmic and distant like chains striking hollow metal. Then a single sentence, barely audible over the static, "Someone's out there." The next moments were chaos. The frame jolted as if the person holding the camera had started to run. Leaves and branches blurred past. A voice cried out, "Female!" Panicked, but the words were indecipherable. The footage cut again, returning briefly to a wide, unsteady shot of the forest. In the distance, the outline of the old lookout tower appeared through the trees. Its base was dark. The door at the bottom hung open. Then the tape ended for weeks. Analysts replayed those final seconds, slowing them down, enhancing the audio. The footage was grainy, the light low, but they managed to stabilize several frames. In one of them, 3 seconds before the blackout, they noticed something no one had seen at first. A faint shape stood between 2 trees just left of the flashlight beam. It wasn't one of the campers. The silhouette was too tall. The posture wrong, motionless, facing directly toward the camera. The discovery ignited public fascination and renewed the investigation. Federal agents were brought in to verify authenticity. They confirmed the footage was genuine, unedited, and consistent with a late 1990 Hi-8 recording. Weathering on the casing matched years of exposure to the elements, suggesting the camera had indeed lain there undisturbed since the group vanished. Audio specialists spent months enhancing the sound. Using noise reduction and spectral filtering, they uncovered faint background layers previously lost under static. Alongside the metallic clanging was something else. Soft crying, distinctly female, recurring at intervals. It was impossible to tell if it came from someone in the group or something farther away. One analyst swore he could hear words beneath the crying, a whisper repeating but never clear enough to transcribe. For law enforcement, the tape presented more questions than answers. Skeptics suggested it could have been staged, students filming a horror short that went wrong. But the physical evidence contradicted that theory. The gear found at the burnt campsite matched what appeared on the footage, down to the same brand of tent poles and cooking pots. Moreover, the direction of sunlight and vegetation confirmed the time frame was accurate for late August. It wasn't performance. It was documentation. Investigators tried to retrace the group's path using timestamps embedded in the video's metadata. The terrain visible in the footage matched an area 5 miles east of the original search zone, just beyond where official teams had stopped in 1998 due to steep elevation and lack of access roads. The assumption now was that the group had strayed farther than anyone believed, possibly in search of the tower that appeared in the final shot. When families were shown excerpts of the recovered footage, reactions were divided between grief and disbelief. Some couldn't bear to watch past the laughter, freezing the frame where their loved ones still smiled at the camera. Others fixated on the final seconds, convinced that if someone studied it long enough, the silhouette would reveal something, anything, to explain what happened. By late 2003, the tape was entered as Exhibit 47 in the reopened case file. Forensic analysts released their findings in a report that ran nearly 90 pages. The official conclusion described the footage as consistent with a spontaneous environmental emergency or panic response in low visibility. Unofficially, agents admitted they didn't know what they were looking at. There was one final discovery buried in the appendix of that report. When technicians enhanced the video frame by frame, they found a brief half-second flicker too short to notice in real time. immediately before the camera jerked downward. In that single frame, the light caught something reflective near the tower's base, like metal. Some thought it might be a piece of equipment or an old sign. Others argued it looked more like an eye catching the beam. The footage ended there, black screen, silence. For years after, copies circulated quietly among investigators and documentary filmmakers, each trying to make sense of what was captured that night. Some swore the tape was cursed, claiming that those who watched it alone heard the same faint crying when the room went still. For the families, the only thing that mattered was what it proved: that their children had made it farther than anyone thought, that they had seen the tower. Their final moments, however terrifying, were real, and yet even with all the analysis, the official investigation stalled once again. The forest remained unchanged. The tower still stood somewhere deep in the hollow, its base open, its door forever swinging in the wind. 5 years after the tape surfaced, investigators returned to that location one last time. What they found buried beneath the roots near the tower finally forced them to confront what the footage had only hinted at, reopening a mystery that should have ended years before. By early 2004, nearly a year after the discovery of the lost Hi-8 tape, investigators decided to revisit the forest. Technology had advanced since the original search, and the newly digitized footage had provided coordinates close enough to narrow down the area. The goal was simple: find the old lookout tower. The forest had long since reclaimed most man-made structures. Somewhere within those ridges, the tower still stood, and perhaps nearby, the answers waited. A joint task team from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the National Park Service hiked in during the last week of February. Snowmelt had left the trails slick and unstable. They relied on GPS markers and ground-penetrating radar to guide them through the steep valleys that had once defeated earlier searches. After nearly a day of climbing, they reached the tower from the footage. Rusted, skeletal, and silent, it rose from a clearing half swallowed by vines. The wooden steps had collapsed long ago, and the metal frame groaned faintly in the wind. The ground beneath was uneven, pocked with sinkholes and soft soil. Investigators set up cadaver dogs around the perimeter, hoping that even after all these years, traces of human remains might linger. Within an hour, the first dog alerted near the tower's base. Moments later, another did the same. The team marked the spots and began shallow excavation, careful and deliberate. By afternoon, they'd unearthed bones, small, scattered, but unmistakably real. At first, relief swept through the group. After years of searching, they thought they'd finally found evidence of the seven, but that relief vanished as soon as the forensic anthropologist examined them. The bones weren't human. They belonged to deer, maybe raccoon. Animal remains, not people. The disappointment was palpable. The search continued for 3 more days, expanding outward in concentric circles. Metal detectors found fragments of rusted tools, nails, and old radio components buried in the dirt. One object, a dented ranger badge, confirmed the tower had once served as an official lookout post. But there was no sign of the campers, no trace of tents, clothing, or personal effects. It was as though they'd never reached that point at all. Then came the stories, quiet at first, shared in murmurs between volunteers and locals who had joined the new effort. Some said the tower wasn't safe to begin with, that decades ago it had been built over a sealed coal shaft. Others swore they'd seen strange lights flicker near it during storms, pale glows that moved between the trees before vanishing altogether. Locals called it the Hollow That Hums, a nickname dating back to the 1960s. For years, teenagers had dared each other to camp near it. Most never stayed through the night. When reporters began to resurface the story, a retired ranger named Walter Briggs came forward. He'd worked the Cherokee district in the late 1980s, and his voice carried the gravelly conviction of someone burdened by memory. He told investigators that the tower had officially been decommissioned in 1989, not because of structural decay, as the paperwork claimed, but because of unexplained safety incidents. When pressed, he described 2 disappearances from that year, a surveyor and a young ranger trainee, both last seen within half a mile of the tower. Neither was found. The report was sealed, citing unstable ground conditions. Briggs said the phrase had always bothered him. It wasn't the ground that was unstable, he told one journalist, it was what people said they heard up there. The ranger story reignited public interest. Television crews returned to the area, filming drone shots of the tower and airing interviews with the families of the 7 missing campers. Some family members refused to participate. They were tired of speculation. Others welcomed the renewed attention. For them, silence was worse than false hope. Tyler Hayes' father, Richard, became the most visible advocate. A former auto mechanic, he had turned his grief into obsession. Every August, on the anniversary of the group's disappearance, he hiked into Cherokee with a handheld GPS and a notebook. Locals got used to seeing him on the trails, walking alone, retracing the routes they believed the group might have taken. He carried with him photocopies of the last frames from the recovered tape, one showing the tower, the other the faint silhouette between the trees. Each year he said he noticed something new, something he'd missed before. It was a ritual that gave his loss a rhythm. "If I stop looking," he told a local paper, "then it's like they never existed." Around that same time, federal analysts decided to revisit the high-8 footage with more advanced forensic tools. Technology had evolved dramatically in the decades since the original analysis, allowing for better audio separation and spectral cleaning. When they ran the final 15 minutes of the tape through modern software, they found something that no one had caught before: a faint, distorted voice layered beneath the chaos. It was deep, mechanical, and low, like it had been recorded from far away. Only 2 words were clear: "Go back." The discovery split the investigation in 2 directions. Skeptics argued it was an audio artifact, a feedback loop caused by the microphone picking up internal interference. But others, including several audio specialists, disagreed. They pointed out that the voice's frequency range didn't match the recorder's internal hum, suggesting it came from an external source. When investigators compared the timestamp, the phrase coincided precisely with the moment the group's flashlight jerked toward the trees, right before the figure appeared in the distance. The revelation made national headlines. Overnight, the case transformed from an old regional tragedy into a modern mystery. News outlets replayed the enhanced clip on television, looping the distorted voice over and over. Online forums erupted with theories, everything from local legends to government cover-ups. Families of the missing were both grateful and horrified. For some, it was the first time they'd heard the tape in full. One mother described it as like hearing them die all over again. In the weeks that followed, Cherokee National Forest became a site of pilgrimage for thrill-seekers and amateur investigators. People brought cameras, EMF meters, and night vision gear, hoping to capture something unseen. Locals resented it. Searchers had once combed these woods for answers, but now it had turned into spectacle. The sheriff at the time released a statement pleading with the public to stay out, warning that the terrain was unstable and dangerous, especially around the tower. Still, people came. By the end of that year, official investigators had little new to show. The tower was fenced off and declared structurally unsafe. Excavation at its base had yielded nothing beyond the same old relics and animal remains. But for those who had been there, the rangers, the volunteers, even the journalists, the memory lingered. Everyone described the same feeling: an oppressive silence that fell the moment they stepped into the clearing. No birds, no wind, no echo, just stillness, heavy and absolute. When the reanalysis report was released, it ended with a single paragraph that stood out among the technical jargon. It read, "The voice anomaly captured on tape segment 3B cannot be conclusively attributed to environmental interference. Contextual analysis indicates a possible external origin consistent with human vocalization." That line, buried on page 42, changed everything. It meant that someone or something had been near the group that night. As the families learned what had been captured on the tape, one question began to dominate every conversation. If the voice said, "Go back," what exactly were they walking toward? In the years that followed, that question would draw them back into the forest again. This time not for closure, but to uncover what the group might have found in the dark before the camera went black. Every story on this channel takes weeks of digging, checking records, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that deserve to be remembered. We do it because these stories matter, and because someone out there still deserves to be remembered. By 2016, nearly 2 decades had passed since 7 young people vanished into the Ducker's Cherokee National Forest, leaving behind nothing but a damaged camcorder and years of speculation. The families had aged into quiet grief. Investigators had retired, replaced by a new generation of detectives who had grown up hearing the case mentioned in training rooms and late-night patrol briefings. The forest itself had changed, slowly reclaiming old paths and clearing undergrowth. Trails that were once easy to follow had become overgrown, and the hollow that hums seemed even quieter, as if the absence of the 7 campers had left a void. Richard Hayes continued his annual pilgrimage, often accompanied by volunteers who shared his obsession, marking coordinates, taking notes, and occasionally hearing sounds they couldn't explain. Technology had improved further, allowing investigators to cross-reference old high-8 tape frames with aerial and satellite imagery. Shadows in the footage aligned with the terrain in ways that confirmed the group's location. And yet the questions remained. Who or what had caused that figure to appear? What had prompted the warning voice? And why had the forest swallowed the 7 young people without a trace? Investigators also began to review other disappearances in the Cherokee National Forest, comparing patterns, locations, and timelines. A disturbing trend emerged. Several incidents clustered around ridges and abandoned lookout towers, all with similar anomalies: known remains, odd audio phenomena, and fleeting visual sightings. It suggested that whatever the campers had encountered was not unique to that night. Families and advocates organized memorial hikes and public forums, both to honor the missing and to push authorities to reopen investigations. Tyler Hayes' father became the face of this movement, appearing in interviews and documentaries, tirelessly retracing paths, always carrying a copy of the tape. The faint silhouette from the footage, a small ghost in the corner of every frame, remained the symbol of their mystery. By the end of the decade, the story had become a permanent legend of the region. Local schools taught about the hollow that hums as cautionary folklore. Amateur researchers continued returning with equipment, hoping to capture an explanation. And the forest, vast, indifferent, and quiet, held its secrets as tightly as it had in 1998. Even as official efforts waned, the recovered high-8 tape became the definitive artifact of the case. Its images, sounds, and cryptic warnings ensured that the memory of the 7 campers endured, not just as missing persons but as witnesses to something deep and unknowable within Cherokee National Forest. Richard Hayes reflected on it often, staring at maps and photographs, whispering their names into the wind. Each visit was an attempt to reconcile grief with hope, terror with curiosity. He often remarked that even if the forest never revealed what had happened, the journey itself, tracking, observing, seeking, was the closest anyone could come to preserving the memory of those lost. The tape, the tower, the forest, and the warnings remained central to every new investigation. Each year, as new technology emerged, investigators returned to the hollow that hums, testing hypotheses, scanning for anomalies, and attempting to unravel a mystery that had defied explanation for nearly 2 decades. The legacy of the 7 missing campers continued to grow. It was not only a story of disappearance, but a story of human persistence, the refusal to forget, and the eerie, persistent draw of a place that had taken so much yet revealed so little. The forest remained, as it always had, a living entity, patient, watchful, and silent, keeping the secrets of those last moments hidden, as if waiting for the day someone might finally understand what transpired within its depths. The case remains open. The files, the tape, and the memories endure, ensuring that the 7 friends are not forgotten. And though decades have passed, every rustle in the hollow that hums, every shadow cast by the tower reminds the world that the forest still has stories to tell, and some mysteries refuse to fade. The camcorder and its footage became the bridge between the past and present, a haunting reminder of ordinary lives interrupted, and a doorway into a narrative that continues to challenge investigators, historians, and the families who still search for answers. Every year, researchers, thrill seekers, and the families themselves return, retracing paths, scanning for anomalies, listening for faint whispers in the wind. It is a ritual born of grief, curiosity, and a relentless need for closure that may never come. Yet each step taken in the hollow brings them closer, not to answers but to understanding that some secrets belong to the forest alone, and some voices, captured faintly on a damaged high-8 tape, are meant to echo forever. No one who ventures into the hollow that hums walks away unchanged. The 7 young friends lost to time remain at the center of every story, every theory, and every whispered legend. Their disappearance is more than a mystery. It is a testament to the power of the unknown, the weight of human curiosity, and the unforgiving depth of Cherokee National Forest. And as the forest stretches endlessly, patient and silent, the tape, the tower, and the missing 7 continue to hold a place in the minds of those who remember, and those who dare to seek the truth behind the shadows. The forest stretched on, unbroken and indifferent. By 2017, the disappearance of the 7 campers had solidified into regional legend. Yet the recovered Hi-8 tape ensured the case remained alive in both public consciousness and investigative circles. Federal agents, now equipped with LiDAR, thermal imaging, and multispectral cameras, returned to Cherokee National Forest, determined to identify any trace of the campers, the old lookout tower, or anomalies consistent with the footage. Small teams moved through dense undergrowth, hiking overgrown trails, scanning every crevice, fallen log, and exposed rock. Every detail was documented meticulously, yet the forest resisted revelation. Thermal scans revealed no human heat signatures. LiDAR showed the skeletal remains of the old tower, half hidden beneath vines and soil, but nothing else. The ground remained untouched, as though the forest had erased every step of the camper's journey. Richard Hayes continued his personal search, independent of formal investigation. He mapped the terrain in detail, noting elevation changes, watercourses, and probable paths taken by the group. He retraced the Hi-8 tape's frames, aligning the flashlight beam with the terrain, seeking a physical match to the footage. Some locations hinted at obstacles now absent: fallen trees, collapsed ridges, overgrown paths. The forest had shifted over 2 decades, removing both evidence and memory. In spring, a newly formed cold case unit, specializing in terrain-related disappearances, reopened the investigation. The idea came from a federal geospatial analyst who believed that modern mapping drones and ground-penetrating radar could reveal what earlier teams had missed. Satellite imagery revealed irregular patterns near the old tower, shapes suggesting cavities or depressions beneath the forest floor. The coordinates were less than a mile from where the camcorder had been recovered. It wasn't much, but it was enough. By June, the team had established a base near Black Hollow Ridge. The forest appeared almost unchanged since 1998. Moss-covered roots snaked across the trails, and the air was dense with the same damp silence that had haunted previous searchers. Drones scanned the canopy, mapping thermal inconsistencies. One reading stood out: a circular depression barely visible from above, about 200 feet across, surrounded by collapsed soil and deadfall. Ground-penetrating radar revealed voids beneath the surface, empty spaces extending downward at irregular depths. Excavation began. The first few feet revealed only mud and rock, but at roughly 20 feet down they struck open air. The mouth of an old mine vent emerged, narrow, jagged, and descending steeply. Edges were unstable, lined with broken timbers and rusted bolts. Historical blueprints confirmed minor coal extraction had occurred in the area during the 1940s, though none of it appeared on modern maps. Cameras lowered into the shaft revealed a cavity about 30 feet deep, filled with debris, fallen beams, soil, and glimpses of faded fabric, metal cookware, and a corner of a nylon backpack. The items were carefully photographed, tagged, and retrieved. Laid out on the forest floor, the collection cast a chilling weight over the team. A rusted camping pot, a torn sleeping bag, a mangled flashlight, each artifact compared with known records of the missing camper's possessions. One detail stood out. The cooking pot was identical to the one captured in the recovered 1998 footage. Even after years of corrosion, the faint manufacturer's imprint matched. Fabric fragments underwent mitochondrial DNA analysis. Weeks later, results confirmed 2 identities: Tyler Hayes and Katie Monroe. Both were traced to degraded tissue in the sleeping bag lining. The other 5 showed no match. For families, this was the first definitive evidence that some of the campers had reached the tower area, possibly perishing there. Yet the discovery prompted more questions than answers. Why only 2 accounted for? Why no skeletal remains of the others? Why did the artifact suggest deliberate placement rather than accidental scattering? Forensic anthropologists noted disturbing details. The sleeping bag and fabric fragments bore no tearing or blunt force damage consistent with a fall. Soil layering suggested gradual deposition, not a single event. Cookware and flashlight appeared deliberately arranged. FBI analysts ran 3D reconstructions of the shaft. The entry sloped downward for 12 feet before collapsing into a vertical pit. Visibility at night would have been minimal. 2 might have fallen accidentally, Tyler and Katie, while the others fled or sought help. Yet this theory contradicted the high-8 footage, which showed the group moving together toward the tower, not away. Some experts quietly suggested an alternative scenario: post-mortem relocation. The absence of skeletal trauma and careful placement of artifacts implied that someone, unknown, may have deposited items long after the disappearance. The FBI refused to classify the case as homicide. Officially, it remained a wilderness accident. Unofficially, inconsistencies persisted. Internal reports referenced secondary disturbances and unverified human activity in the area between 1999 and 2001. Journalists pressed for details, but the Bureau cited ongoing forensic review and declined comment. Families received boxes labeled evidence returns, containing recovered items. Tyler's father opened his alone in the garage. Lifting the rusted cooking pot, still flecked with soil, he stared for an hour before covering it with a towel. To him, it wasn't proof of death. It was proof someone else had interacted with the objects, someone not meant to be there. Private digital forensics teams re-examined the high-8 footage. Using advanced light mapping, they analyzed reflections and lens glare, refining the final seconds. The results unsettled even skeptics. Just before the camera turns to the tower, in the 2 seconds when the group walked past the lens, laughing and unaware, a faint reflection appeared in the camcorder's metallic casing. Slowed to 1/120th speed, it revealed a partial figure, the outline of a shoulder, the curve of a hat, and a metallic glint on the chest. The figure's height and build didn't match any of the 7. Whoever it was stood still, observing the group from behind the trees. Families reacted differently. Some dismissed it as lens flare or distortion. Others, like Tyler's father, claimed they had always sensed another presence. The federal report didn't include this discovery. It was too inconclusive for admissibility. Yet for longtime investigators, it confirmed a fear they'd quietly carried. The forest hadn't just taken them. Someone or something had been with them. After the expedition, the site was resealed. The pit filled, the tower fenced off. Officially, the case remained closed pending further evidence. But those who had entered Black Hollow Ridge described a persistent heaviness, a pressure in the air as though the forest itself remembered. By 2016, nearly 2 decades had passed since the disappearance in Ducker's Cherokee National Forest. Families had aged into quiet grief. Investigators retired, replaced by a new generation who had grown up hearing the case referenced in patrol briefings and training rooms. The forest, timeless and indifferent, still held secrets that modern technology could illuminate, yet could not fully explain. They said it wasn't merely the silence that haunted those who returned. It was the sense that something beneath the forest floor still lingered, waiting to be discovered. Years later, when the case resurfaced again, it began not with a body or artifact, but with a detail long overlooked on the original tape, something that would force investigators to question whether the 7 friends had truly been alone. By the early 2020s, the disappearance of the 7 campers had largely faded from national headlines, yet the small Tennessee towns bordering the Cherokee National Forest never forgot. For the families, time had not dulled the wound. It had only made the forest's quiet more unbearable. When a streaming documentary producer approached them about revisiting the case, hesitation was widespread. Some had spent years attempting to forget, while others saw the chance for fresh eyes to uncover something everyone else had missed. The recovered high-8 footage, long locked away in evidence storage, had never been released in full. The documentary, titled The Lost Weekend: What the Forest Hid, premiered in late 2022. It reconstructed the timeline of the campers' final days, showcasing newly stabilized and digitally enhanced portions of the tape. For the first time, the public saw what investigators had glimpsed years prior: a laughing group moving through the forest, unaware of the darkness lurking just beyond the trees. Then the chaotic final 15 minutes unfolded. The faint metallic clanging, the frantic breathing, the whispered warning, "Someone's out there," played for audiences who could now clearly observe a detail previously lost in the chaos, a fleeting reflection. During production, forensic analysts revisited the tape frame by frame. Using advanced light mapping and image enhancement, they clarified the reflection caught in the camcorder casing just before the tape ended. What once appeared to be a trick of light was unmistakable. a man standing several feet behind the group facing them directly. His clothing was distinct, a dark green jacket, khaki trousers, and a ranger-style campaign hat. Archival experts cross-referenced the silhouette with uniform styles from every era of the U.S. Forest Service. The discovery was chilling. The uniform did not match modern rangers but aligned with those issued in the early 1970s, specifically to volunteer fire lookouts assigned to Cherokee watchtowers. The last known ranger stationed at that tower, Robert Clay, had vanished in 1974. His disappearance had barely made the newspapers. Listed as missing after failing to check in during a patrol, his cabin was found in order, his logbook left open on the desk. No struggle, no farewell, no body. The official explanation suggested a fall or disorientation in bad weather, though no remains were ever found. For decades, Clay's file sat untouched until the documentary researchers requested access. Within the archive lay field notes, maps, and a final entry dated 2 days before his disappearance. Heard the voices again tonight. Sounded like they were coming from below. The line had been circled twice in red pencil. Below it, in different handwriting, possibly that of his supervisor, a note read, "Tower closed until further notice." This revelation connected the 1974 incident directly to the 1998 disappearance, implying that whatever haunted those woods had roots stretching back decades. The filmmakers reached out to surviving rangers from that era. Most refused comment, but one elderly former ranger, Gerald McAdams, agreed to speak. He described the tower as unofficially off-limits long before its decommissioning. "We used to hear stories," he said. "Voices past midnight. Sometimes calls for help, sometimes laughter. We thought it was wind through the hollow." His voice trailed off, leaving the implication unspoken. The documentary's final act unfolded deliberately. Drone footage showed the forest as it stood now, dense, overgrown, and silent. The tower had collapsed years earlier, leaving only a steel base half buried in vines. Investigators were shown standing in the clearing, reading aloud from Clay's logbook while the narrator speculated on the camper's final movements. The working theory proposed that the group had entered the same area where Clay had vanished, perhaps following the sound of running water or some other misinterpreted signal. Family interviews formed the documentary's emotional center. Richard Hayes, Tyler's father, now gray and soft-spoken, described his ongoing visits every August. "I used to think if I just kept looking I'd find them," he said. "Now I think maybe the forest doesn't want to be found. Maybe it just wants to be left alone." Emily Ward's sister, holding a framed photo of her sibling, added, "At least now we know they weren't imagining it. There really was someone there. Maybe not alive, but someone." The film revisited the tape's final seconds, slowed into a single still frame. The tower's base loomed in the distance, its open door visible just beyond the flashlight beam. Overlaid was the newly clarified reflection, color-corrected to reveal the faint green of a ranger jacket. Analysis confirmed that the figure was not any of the 7 campers. All their positions were accounted for in the frame. Whoever stood behind them had never belonged to the group. A closing voiceover from the lead investigator summarized what decades of files and speculation could not. "We may never know exactly what happened out there, but whatever it wasn't random. It happened in the same place to the same kind of people, those who went looking for answers where they were told not to go." The documentary ended on a lingering image of the forest. Mist drifted between the trees, soft morning light spilling across moss-covered stones where the tower had once stood. No markers, no fences, only silence. The camera rested on the ground where the structure had collapsed, the earth slowly reclaiming what it had once supported. As the narrator delivered the final lines, the sound almost vanished. "The forest never gives back everything it takes," the voice said quietly. "But sometimes it leaves behind a reminder, just long enough to make us remember." In the last moments, the screen went black. A faint static hissed through the speakers, and beneath it, barely audible, a slow, steady rhythm emerged. Breathing. The same sound recorded in the final seconds of the camper's tape 24 years earlier. Then silence.